Most mothers fear the day they are carried out of their homes in silence. But I watched my own son stand in front of a room full of people and declare that I no longer existed to him, and I was still breathing when he did it. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, under white roses and rented chandeliers, with violins playing softly in the background and champagne glasses clinking like nothing was wrong. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the world did not tremble when mine split clean in half. I had ironed my navy blue dress twice that morning because I wanted to look dignified, wanted to look like the kind of mother who raised a good man, and yet by sunset, I was sitting alone in the parking lot gripping my purse like it was the only thing left in my name. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would one day be asked to leave my own son's wedding reception, not as a guest who overstayed her welcome, but as a woman publicly accused of poisoning her child's future, I would have laughed gently and said, "You were mistaken. Mothers do not imagine being erased. We imagine being thanked, perhaps hugged too tightly, perhaps seated in the front row with trembling hands and proud tears. We do not imagine hearing the words, 'We are moving forward without her,' spoken into a microphone while 160 faces turned to study the lines in our aging skin. I did not cry then. That is what surprises people when I tell them. I did not scream. I did not defend myself. I did not beg. I simply sat there while my daughter-in-law held his hand and nodded softly beside him, as if she were witnessing something necessary, something brave. The guests shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note, and in that pause, that thin, fragile pause between humiliation and departure, I understood something I had refused to see for years. But before I tell you what he said, before I tell you why my son believed I deserved that public burial, you need to understand what I gave him. What I signed over quietly in an office that smelled of stale coffee and printer ink, and how love can slowly become a lever someone else uses to pry open your life. Because that afternoon did not begin at a wedding. It began 18 months earlier, when I made a decision that cost me everything I had saved since the day my husband died. And if I had known what that signature would lead to, I would have let the roof leak. The first crack did not appear in my relationship with my son at his wedding. It appeared on my living room ceiling during a spring storm, a thin brown line spreading slowly above the curtains, while rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. And I remember standing beneath it with a towel in my hand, thinking how small problems never stay small when you ignore them long enough. I was 68 then, widowed for nearly 9 years, living alone in the house his father and I had bought when interest rates were high and hope was higher, and that house had become the last physical proof that my life with his father had once been loud and solid and full. Daniel called that evening after I left him, a voicemail about the leak, and his voice carried the urgency of someone who had already decided the solution before hearing the details. "Mom, you can't keep living like that," he said, as if I were surviving in ruins instead of in the same modest 3-bedroom home where he had learned to walk. He came the next morning with a contractor, walked through each room measuring walls, tapping on drywall, examining pipes under sinks, and with every frown his concern seemed to grow deeper, more protective, almost heroic. By the time they left, I felt fragile, as though the house had aged overnight and I with it. 2 days later, he returned with papers. Not angry papers, not threatening ones, just neat, organized documents tucked inside a leather folder that smelled faintly of cologne and printer toner. He set them on my dining table, the same table where I once packed his school lunches and later sorted through hospital bills after his father's diagnosis. And he explained everything slowly, patiently, like a son guiding his mother through something complicated. The repairs would be extensive, he said, and banks did not lend easily to retirees living on fixed income. But there was another option, one that would make everything simpler and safer for me in the long run. If you transfer the house into my name, he said, reaching for my hand, I can secure the renovation loan at a lower rate. It's still yours, Mom. I'm just helping. We're protecting what Dad built. Protecting what Dad built. That sentence settled into me like warmth. I could almost hear my husband's voice agreeing, practical and steady. Daniel had always been good with numbers, good with paperwork, better than I ever was. I trusted him the way only a mother trusts the child she once held against her chest at 3 a.m. when fevers ran high and fear ran higher. I did not see risk. I saw devotion. The attorney's office smelled faintly of dust and brewed coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. A fluorescent light flickered softly above us. The lawyer explained the transfer in careful language. A standard procedure, a common arrangement, nothing to worry about. And Daniel nodded at every sentence as if he were sealing a promise with each movement. My hands trembled slightly when I held the pen, not from doubt, but from age, from arthritis that stiffened my knuckles on cold mornings. Daniel placed his hand gently over mine to steady it. Just here, Mom, he said softly. And I signed. It was only ink on paper, only my name written in the same looping script I had used for decades. But something invisible shifted in that moment, something too subtle to recognize. I remember the quiet click of the pen when I closed it, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the lawyer sliding the documents neatly into a file. It felt procedural, harmless, even responsible. I believed I had done something wise for our family. The renovations began within weeks. Workers moved through my home carrying ladders and tools, tearing out cabinets, replacing pipes, reinforcing beams in the attic. The smell of sawdust lingered in the air for days. Daniel handled every invoice, every call, every payment. I thanked him repeatedly. He told me not to, that this was what sons did. Sometimes he would stand in the doorway watching the progress with his arms folded, and I felt proud, deeply proud, that I had raised a man who stepped in when needed. But somewhere between the demolition and the fresh coat of paint, small changes began to appear that had nothing to do with the structure of the house. Daniel started using phrases like, my property, when speaking to contractors. He suggested converting my sewing room into a home office in case we need it. He asked about my will in a tone that felt practical but lingered longer than comfort allowed. I brushed off each unease like dust on a windowsill. Children grow up, I told myself. They take responsibility. That is not betrayal. 3 months after the renovation was complete, Daniel invited me to dinner. His fiancée, Claire, set the table with careful precision, candles lit, wine poured before I even sat down. She was polite, always polite, her smile perfectly measured. Halfway through the meal, Daniel cleared his throat and spoke in that same steady voice he had used in the attorney's office. Mom, we've been thinking. It might make sense for you to downsize eventually. The house is a lot for you to manage alone. Downsize. The word floated between us like something fragile and sharp at the same time. I laughed lightly, asked why we were discussing such things when the paint had barely dried. Claire reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's hand, and in that small gesture, I felt an alliance I did not fully understand. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen, and for the first time in years, the house did not feel entirely mine. It felt watched, measured, assessed. I told myself it was imagination. I told myself aging makes a woman sentimental and suspicious. But 6 months later, I would learn that sentimentality had nothing to do with it. Because the call that changed everything did not come from my son. It came from the bank. And when the man on the other end said my name in a formal tone I had never heard before, I realized that what I had signed in trust had already been used in ways I had never agreed to. And that was the moment the confusion began to replace the pride. If you think the signature was the worst part, you're wrong. What happened next is when I first understood that love can be rearranged into leverage, and that a mother's devotion can quietly become collateral. The bank manager did not raise his voice. He did not accuse me of anything. He did not even sound unkind. And somehow, that made it worse. Because when strangers speak gently while your world tilts sideways, you know the ground beneath you has already shifted. I was standing at my kitchen sink when the call came, rinsing a teacup, watching soap bubbles slide slowly toward the drain. And I remember how the afternoon light hit the window in such an ordinary way that it felt cruel. Life should not look normal when something is breaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, pronouncing my married name carefully. "I'm calling to verify your awareness of the equity line attached to the property at 214 Cedar Hollow." Equity line. The words did not land at first. I dried my hands on a dish towel and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed those papers months earlier. "I'm not sure I understand," I told him, my voice steady, almost polite. I have always been polite, even when I shouldn't be. He paused, papers rustling softly on his end. "A home equity line of credit was opened 4 months ago under the property owner's authorization. We simply need confirmation that you are aware of the increased liability." Property owner, authorization, liability. Each word felt like a pebble dropped into still water, widening circles of realization spreading outward until they touched something I had been refusing to see. I asked him to repeat himself. He did. Slowly, kindly, thoroughly. Daniel had taken out a substantial loan against the house, against my house, the house that no longer legally belonged to me. I felt heat crawl up my neck and into my cheeks. Not anger at first, just confusion, thick and disorienting. "That must be a mistake," I said softly. "My son handles the paperwork, but I wasn't informed about any new loan." The manager's tone shifted ever so slightly, still respectful, but firmer now. "Mrs. Whitmore, as the previous owner, your name remains associated with certain historical records. However, legally, the current deed holder has full authority to make financial decisions regarding the property." Legally. I ended the call with trembling fingers. The house felt different again, heavier somehow, like it was aware of the debt hanging quietly around its beams and drywall. I walked from room to room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the mantel, the hallway wall where we had once measured Daniel's height in pencil marks that still faintly showed through the new paint. I had signed the house into his name to protect it. Instead, it had become collateral. I called him immediately. He answered on the third ring, cheerful, distracted. I could hear traffic in the background. "Mom, what's up?" I asked him about the equity line. There was a pause, not long, but long enough for something inside me to tighten. "Oh, that," he said lightly, as if I had asked about a grocery list. "It's just a smart financial move. The rates were good. We're investing in a business opportunity Claire's cousin brought us." Investing. Opportunity. Words that glitter on the outside, but hide risk beneath them. "Daniel," I said carefully, You didn't think to tell me? He exhaled sharply, and for the first time since his father's funeral, his tone carried impatience when speaking to me. Mom, it's my property now. That was the whole point. You wanted me to handle things. My property. There it was again. The shift from ours to mine. The house where I still slept each night, where my husband's photograph still sat on the dresser, where my garden bloomed every spring, was now simply an asset on a spreadsheet in my son's expanding life. I transferred it so you could help with repairs, I reminded him, my voice thinner than I intended. Not so you could leverage it. He laughed softly, not cruelly, but dismissively. You're overthinking this. It's how business works. You always told me to be smart. I ended the call soon after, because my hands would not stop shaking. I could see them resting on the table, veins raised, skin thinner than it used to be, fingers that had once buttoned his shirts and tied his shoes, now trembling as if they belonged to someone else. That evening, the house felt unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with paint or renovations. I lay in bed listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the hallway clock, and every sound seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were whispering that I had signed away more than ownership. I had signed away control. Over the next weeks, subtle changes unfolded. Daniel visited less often. Claire began discussing future plans that did not always include me living there long term. Phrases like, "when we eventually move in," slipped into conversation as if casually, but never accidentally. I noticed how they assessed the backyard with practical eyes, how they spoke about converting the garage, how Claire once measured the master bedroom window with a quiet efficiency that felt like rehearsal. I tried to reason with myself. Children build their lives. They make plans. That is not betrayal. That is growth. But confusion slowly turned into something colder, something heavier. Then one evening, as I sorted through mail at the kitchen table, I found an envelope addressed to Daniel from a real estate firm. Inside was a market analysis of my neighborhood, complete with projected sale values and timing recommendations. Projected sale values. I stared at the number printed in bold near the bottom of the page. It was far higher than I expected, enough to fund a comfortable new beginning for a young couple. Enough to make an aging mother an inconvenience. I waited 3 days before confronting him. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, that perhaps I had misunderstood something again. But when I asked him about it, his response did not calm me. "We're just exploring options," he said. "You can't expect to live in a 4-bedroom house forever, Mom. It doesn't make sense." Doesn't make sense? After that conversation, something inside me shifted from confusion to quiet fear. Not fear of being alone. I had been alone since my husband passed. This was different. This was the fear of being displaced, of becoming temporary in the only space that still held the shape of my life. And yet, even then, I did not imagine what he would eventually do. I did not imagine microphones, public declarations, the humiliation of being labeled a burden in front of strangers dressed for celebration. I still believed we could talk this through. I still believed a mother and son could sit at a table and find their way back to understanding. What I did not know was that conversations were already happening without me. Decisions were being rehearsed. Words were being prepared. And by the time I realized how far it had gone, the wedding invitations had already been mailed. I should have known something was wrong the moment my son chose my dress for his wedding. Daniel had never cared about fabrics or colors in his life, not when I wore the same navy coat for 10 winters, not when I showed up to church in sensible shoes instead of heels, and yet suddenly he was holding a silver swatch beneath my chin, tilting his head as if he were adjusting a display in a shop window. "It'll photograph well," he said. "Photograph well. Not beautiful. Not elegant. Not you look lovely, Mom. Just practical. Strategic. Coordinated." Claire watched from the sofa, smiling in that careful way of hers, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Silver is neutral," she added softly. "It won't overpower anything." Overpower. I laughed lightly, because mothers laugh when something feels strange, but they cannot yet name why. I told myself I was being sensitive. Weddings are detailed affairs. Young people plan these things. It meant nothing. But that afternoon, Daniel walked through my house with a measuring gaze I had not seen before. He opened the hall closet and asked how much of it I actually used. He glanced toward the attic stairs and wondered aloud what was stored up there. He stood in the spare bedroom and said, "This would make a great nursery one day." Nursery. My chest tightened. "And where would I be?" I asked, keeping my tone almost playful. He didn't answer right away. He looked at Claire first. A glance. Quick, coordinated. "Well, Mom," he said finally, "you've talked about downsizing before." I had not. "You don't need all this space," he continued. "It's just practical." Practical. Financial sense. Easier. Smaller. Manageable. The words stacked up like boxes around me, slowly narrowing the room. That night I stood alone in my bedroom and ran my hand over the carved edge of the dresser his father built 40 years ago. The wood was worn smooth where my fingers had touched it thousands of times. I opened the closet and stared at the dresses hanging quietly in the dark. The silver one waited in the center. I suddenly understood something that made my stomach drop. I was not being dressed to be honored. I was being dressed to blend in. 3 nights before the wedding, Daniel came by alone. He paced near the fireplace, restless, rehearsing something in his head. "There's going to be a small announcement at the reception," he said carefully. "I just don't want you surprised." My pulse slowed in a way that felt unnatural, like my body was bracing before impact. "What kind of announcement?" I asked. "Just clarity," he replied. "About boundaries, about our future." Boundaries. The word hung in the air between us. "I had a feeling," I said quietly, "that whatever you're about to say won't include me." He didn't deny it. That was the moment I stopped pretending I didn't understand. The wedding was not just a celebration. It was positioning, and I was about to be repositioned publicly. What I did not know yet was how carefully the narrative had already been built without me in the room. The ceremony was painfully beautiful. White roses, warm sunlight, a string quartet playing something soft and hopeful. When Daniel looked at me before the vows, his eyes shimmered slightly, and for one fragile second, I believed I had imagined everything. He said, "I do," with steady conviction. Claire said forever, like it was a contract she had already read twice. Applause rose around us, warm and genuine. I cried quietly, dabbing the corners of my eyes, because love does not disappear just because fear creeps in. But the reception is where the truth arrived. Halfway through dinner, Daniel stood and tapped his glass. The sharp ring of metal against crystal cut through the room. Conversations softened. Forks paused mid-air. My hands were folded around my water glass. I remember noticing the condensation against my skin. Today is about new beginnings, he began. New beginnings. He spoke about independence, about partnership, about building a foundation that could not be shaken. Then his tone shifted. There have been challenges this past year, he said, glancing briefly in my direction. Times when our decisions were guided more than supported. Guided more than supported. A murmur flickered across the tables. Claire stepped forward slightly. We love family, she said gently, but sometimes love requires space, especially when that love becomes influence. Influence. I felt my grip tighten around the glass. It slipped slightly in my hand. A thin crack ran through the side. I hadn't realized how hard I was holding it. Daniel continued, We're grateful for everything that's been done for us, he said, but from this point forward, we'll be making choices without external pressure or financial claims complicating our marriage. Financial claims. There it was, not stated directly, but clear enough. A woman at the nearby table leaned toward her husband and whispered something. I heard my name. My ring finger pressed so deeply into my palm that I felt the crescent of my own nail. The narrative was set. I was not the widow who transferred her home in trust. I was the interfering mother, clinging to control. Perception is louder than paperwork. Applause began again, hesitant, confused, then stronger, as guests chose celebration over discomfort. I did not stand. I did not interrupt. I sat in my silver dress and let the story be told without my voice. When it ended, I rose slowly and walked outside. The parking lot lights hummed overhead. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and spilled champagne drifting through open doors. I stood beside my car and realized something that felt colder than humiliation. They had already positioned me as the obstacle, which meant the next step would not be negotiation. It would be removal. And here is what no one in that room knew. When I signed those documents 18 months ago, there was one clause buried in the paperwork that no one thought to explain carefully. One clause about occupancy rights. One clause that did not disappear simply because the deed changed names. And the morning after the wedding, I drove straight to the attorney's office with a copy of that contract in my purse. Because if my son wanted to redefine me publicly, I was going to redefine the terms privately. The morning after the wedding, I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because humiliation has a way of pushing you upright before your alarm ever rings. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I could still hear the faint echo of that microphone, the careful wording, the polite applause that followed my public erasure. And for a few seconds, I allowed myself to feel it fully. The ache in my chest, the dull pressure behind my eyes, the quiet question that every aging mother asks when her child steps away. Where did I go wrong? But then, something steadier rose beneath the pain, something practical, something I had not accessed in years. And I sat up slowly and reached for the leather folder I had kept in my nightstand drawer ever since the day I signed those papers. The attorney back then had spoken quickly, moving through clauses the way professionals do when they assume everyone in the room understands the implications. But I have always been the kind of woman who reads even the small print on prescription bottles, and somewhere in the blur of legal language I had paused at one paragraph. A section about lifetime occupancy rights retained by the original resident, unless explicitly waived in a separate instrument, and I remember asking about it, and I remember him saying, it simply ensures you cannot be forced out without due process. And Daniel had nodded as if it were irrelevant. as if it were a technicality that would never matter. And at the time I let it pass because why would a son ever need due process to ask his mother to leave? But now, in the pale blue light of early morning, that clause felt less like technical language and more like breath returning to my lungs. I dressed quietly, not in silver this time, but in the navy coat I had worn for years, the one that did not photograph well, but fit me honestly. And I drove across town to a law office with wood-paneled walls and a brass nameplate that read Thomas Ellery, Estate and Property Law. And when the receptionist offered me coffee, I declined because my hands were steady and I wanted to keep them that way. And when Mr. Receptionist offered me, Ellery entered the room. He did not smile in a rehearsed way. He simply listened as I laid the documents across his desk one by one. The deed transfer, the equity loan disclosure, the market analysis, and finally, the clause I had marked with a thin yellow tab 18 months earlier. He adjusted his glasses and read in silence for several minutes. The only sound, the soft rustle of paper, and the faint hum of the ceiling fan above us. And when he finally looked up, his expression was not dramatic. It was measured, almost calm, and that calmness did more for me than any sympathy could have. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you retained a life estate occupancy right. It was never waived. Legally, you cannot be removed from the property without your consent or a court order, and given the circumstances, that would be extremely difficult to obtain." I did not feel triumph in that moment, only clarity. A clearing of fog that had settled over me since the bank call, and I asked him about the equity loan, about the public framing at the wedding, about the possibility that my son might attempt to sell the house regardless. And he nodded thoughtfully and explained that while Daniel held the title, he also held the debt, and that any sale would require addressing my occupancy interest first. And as he spoke, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. Power shifts quietly when paperwork is misunderstood, but it does not disappear entirely. I left his office with copies of everything neatly organized in a fresh folder, and as I stepped into the sunlight, I did not feel younger. I did not feel victorious, but I felt anchored, and that is sometimes enough, because confusion can be paralyzing, but clarity, even painful clarity, allows you to stand upright again. And as I drove home, I passed the florist who had arranged the white roses for the wedding, now sweeping wilted petals from her doorway, and I thought about how quickly celebrations fade while consequences linger. Daniel called that afternoon, his voice tight controlled, asking why I had left the reception early, asking why I seemed distant, and I listened without interrupting until he finished. And then I told him calmly that I had met with an attorney that morning, that I was aware of my occupancy rights, and that any future discussions about the property would be conducted formally, not casually over dinner tables or under chandeliers. And there was a long silence on the line, a silence so complete I could hear his breathing shift from irritation to calculation. "You hired a lawyer," he said finally, and the words were not angry, they were surprised. "I consulted one," I corrected gently, "because clarity matters." That was the moment I felt the balance adjust. Not dramatically, not with shouting or accusations, but with the quiet realization that I was no longer the only person in this story who had underestimated the details. But legal rights are one thing, and family fractures are another. And while paperwork can protect a roof over your head, it does not repair the distance that forms when trust is reframed as interference. And I sensed that Daniel would not retreat easily because public narratives are difficult to undo once spoken into a microphone. What I did not expect was how quickly the situation would escalate beyond private conversations and into something far more deliberate. Because 3 days later, a moving truck appeared at the end of my driveway, and no one had informed me it was coming. The truck arrived just after noon, large and white with the company name printed in bold blue letters along the side, and I watched it from the kitchen window while drying a plate, my heart steady in a way that surprised me, because when confrontation is anticipated, it feels less like shock and more like confirmation. And within minutes, Daniel's car pulled in behind it, Claire in the passenger seat, both of them stepping out with an energy that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. I opened the front door before they reached it, not defensively but deliberately, and stood on the porch as the movers began lowering the back ramp of the truck, the metallic clang echoing through the quiet street, and Daniel approached with a smile that did not quite settle naturally on his face. "We thought we'd start bringing a few things over," he said lightly. "Just temporary, like we discussed." "We did not discuss a date," I replied evenly, and Claire's eyes flickered toward the open doorway behind me, scanning the hallway as if measuring space she already considered usable. Daniel exhaled softly, impatience brushing the edges of his tone. "Mom, we need to move forward. It's practical for us to live here for a while, especially with the loan situation." The loan situation. The equity he had leveraged against walls I still inhabited. I stepped aside slightly, not to invite them in, but to block the movers from advancing further. And I told him that any changes to occupancy required formal agreement, that my rights had not been waived, and that I would not be displaced quietly under the banner of convenience. And for a moment, I saw something unfamiliar in his expression, not anger exactly, but the dawning awareness that the story he told at the wedding had not fully secured the outcome he expected. "Why are you making this adversarial?" Claire asked gently, her voice composed, almost soothing, the way one speaks to someone perceived as irrational. "We're family. Family." The word felt heavier now, less comforting, more conditional. "I am not making it adversarial," I said calmly. "I am making it clear." The movers paused awkwardly beside the truck, glancing between us, uncertain whether to proceed, and Daniel rubbed his forehead the way he used to when math homework frustrated him, except this was not algebra. This was leverage meeting limitation, and after a long, tense minute, he turned toward the truck and told the men to wait, his voice tight with restrained irritation. What followed was not shouting, not dramatic confrontation, but a strained negotiation on my front porch under the bright glare of midday sun, neighbors' curtains shifting slightly as they pretended not to watch. And Daniel insisted that I was overreacting, that I was embarrassing him, that this could have been simple if I had just trusted him, and I listened quietly until he ran out of words. And then I reminded him gently that trust is not the absence of boundaries. It is the presence of respect. He did not have an immediate response to that. Eventually, he told the movers to leave, and the truck reversed slowly down the driveway, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. And as it disappeared around the corner, I felt neither victory nor relief, only a deep aching sadness, because there is something profoundly painful about defending your legal right to remain in the home where you once rocked your child to sleep. Daniel left without hugging me that day. Claire offered a thin smile that did not mask her frustration, and their car pulled away in a sweep of dust that settled slowly back onto the road. And when the street returned to silence, I stood there for several minutes, breathing in the faint scent of cut grass and engine fumes, steadying myself against the reality that this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a contest of narratives. He had framed me publicly as controlling and obstructive. I had responded privately with contracts and clauses, but the story was not finished. Not by a long measure, because tension left unresolved tends to escalate, and Daniel was not the kind of man who accepted limits easily once he had envisioned an outcome. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from him that contained only one sentence. "If you force this, Mom, there will be consequences." I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. Consequences. I had already endured public humiliation, legal maneuvering, and an attempted occupation of my own home. The question was no longer whether there would be consequences. The question was, who would ultimately bear them? When my son warned me there would be consequences, I did not realize how quickly he would begin to define them, or how quietly reputation can be rearranged when spoken to the right ears. Because within a week of that message, I began to notice the subtle shift. The polite smiles at church that did not linger as long. The conversations that softened when I approached the way Mrs. Talbot, who has sat beside me in the third pew for 15 years, suddenly found reasons to leave immediately after service. And it does not take a dramatic confrontation to isolate a woman in her own community, it only takes suggestion. The first direct sign came from the bank again. This time, not a gentle verification call, but a formal letter explaining that the equity line attached to the property was approaching a threshold that required additional documentation. And although my name was no longer on the title, my historical association meant I was being notified as a courtesy that felt more like a reminder that my stability was now entangled with decisions I had not made. I called Daniel calmly and asked what was happening, and he responded with a clipped tone I had never heard from him before, explaining that the business investment had not produced immediate returns, and that temporary financial strain was normal in growth phases. And as he spoke, I heard the faint tremor beneath his confidence. 2 days later, Claire called me directly for the first time without Daniel on the line, her voice composed but edged with something sharper than politeness. She told me that my resistance to their moving in had created unnecessary stress, that lenders prefer stability, that family disputes complicate optics. And there it was again. Optics, perception. The same invisible audience they had catered to at the wedding, now shaping financial conversations behind closed doors. She suggested, gently but unmistakably, that if I cared about Daniel's future, I would reconsider my stance and show unity, because nothing unsettles investors like visible conflict. I listened quietly, then asked her one simple question: whether Daniel had explained the occupancy clause to his lenders when he leveraged the house, and the silence that followed told me more than her words ever could. Because transparency works in more than one direction, and I suspected that while I had been framed publicly as obstructive, certain details had been omitted privately when paperwork was signed. The escalation did not stop there. A certified letter arrived from Daniel's attorney requesting a formal meeting to clarify expectations regarding residential use of the property. Language that sounded neutral, but carried the weight of confrontation, and I sat at my kitchen table reading it slowly, while the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floorboards. And for the first time, I felt not just sadness, but resolve, because I understood now that this was no longer about convenience or even pride. It was about control. At the meeting held in a sterile conference room that smelled faintly of toner and polished wood, Daniel avoided looking directly at me while his attorney outlined proposals: temporary cohabitation arrangements, financial contributions, eventual sale, timelines, and with each suggestion, I felt the underlying objective tighten. They needed access. They needed residency. They needed leverage. To make my occupancy right inconvenient enough that I would relinquish it voluntarily. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply asked that all existing loan documents be disclosed in full, including representations made about current occupancy. And Daniel's attorney hesitated before answering. And in that hesitation, I felt the first real shift in power since the wedding. What emerged over the following weeks was not dramatic scandal, but quiet unraveling. The business Daniel had invested in was struggling far more than he had admitted. Payments on the equity line were being deferred. The market analysis I had found months earlier was no longer theoretical. It was a necessity, because the only substantial asset capable of absorbing the debt was the house itself. And without my consent to vacate, any sale would be complicated, delayed, potentially litigated. Consequences, it turned out, travel in more than one direction. Then came the call that changed the tone entirely. Daniel's voice was different, stripped of public confidence, thinner somehow. The lender had requested clarification about occupancy rights after reviewing updated filings. Questions were being asked. Legal exposure was being assessed. He did not accuse me directly, but the implication hovered in the air that my insistence on formal structure had triggered scrutiny he would rather avoid. I told him calmly that transparency protects everyone involved, and for the first time since the wedding, he did not argue. But consequences do not end at financial strain. They seep into relationships, into marriages built on projected stability, into conversations held behind closed bedroom doors. 3 nights after that call, Claire arrived alone at my doorstep, not polished, not composed, her mascara faintly smudged as if sleep had become difficult. She did not step inside at first. She simply stood there and admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that the pressure was mounting, that the investment partner had withdrawn, that Daniel was considering options she did not fully understand, and beneath her carefully managed exterior, I saw fear. Not for me. Not for the house, but for the foundation she believed she had secured. I did not comfort her. I did not scold her. I simply told her that stability built on omission is fragile, and that marriage requires truth more than property. And she nodded slowly, as if recognizing something too late. What I did not yet know was how close Daniel had come to making a decision that would have altered everything permanently, because the following week, I received notice that he had initiated preliminary steps toward listing the house, despite the unresolved occupancy matter. It was bold, almost reckless, and it signaled that desperation had begun to replace strategy. If the wedding had been the public framing, this was the private gamble. And the next move would determine whether this ended in collapse or in something far more painful for all of us. He did not knock when he arrived that evening. He used his key, the one he had never returned after the deed transfer. And I heard the lock turn while I was stirring soup on the stove, the familiar click sounding suddenly foreign. And when he stepped into the kitchen, his shoulders looked heavier than they had on his wedding day, as if the weight of borrowed certainty had finally begun to press down on him. "We need to talk," he said, and this time there was no rehearsal in his voice. He sat across from me at the table, hands clasped tightly together, avoiding the spot on the wall where his height had once been marked in pencil. He told me the lender was demanding resolution, that the business losses were deeper than expected, that Claire's patience was thinning, that everything hinged on liquidating the property quickly. And then he looked up at me with eyes that still held traces of the boy who once asked me to check for monsters under his bed. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to sign a voluntary release of occupancy. Just temporarily. It will solve everything." solve everything. I studied his face carefully, searching for manipulation, for calculation, but what I saw instead was exhaustion, fear wrapped in pride, and I realized that the consequences he had promised me were now circling him instead. I asked him whether he had told Claire the full truth about the occupancy clause before leveraging the house, and he hesitated long enough to confirm what I already suspected. He had believed I would step aside without resistance. He had believed maternal loyalty would override legal protection. "You could end this tonight," he said softly. "We could all move on. End this. Move on." There is a peculiar ache that settles in a mother's chest when her child asks her to dismantle herself for his convenience, and I felt it then, not as anger, but as deep, slow sorrow. I told him that I would not sign away my right to remain in the home his father and I built, not out of spite, not to punish him, but because surrendering under pressure would teach him the wrong lesson about responsibility. He closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment the silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have been. Then something shifted. The bravado that had fueled the wedding speech, the legal maneuvering, the attempted move-in, all of it drained from his posture, and he admitted in a voice barely audible that the investment had been partially Claire's idea, that he had exaggerated stability to secure her confidence, that the public framing at the reception had been a misguided attempt to preempt what he feared would become conflict. And as he spoke, I saw the architecture of pride collapse quietly under its own weight. "I thought you'd understand," he said finally. "Understand what I wanted to ask, that I would disappear gracefully so his narrative remained intact, that I would carry debt in silence so his marriage appeared strong, that I would accept humiliation so he did not have to admit miscalculation. But instead I asked him one simpler question, whether he remembered the night his father lay in the hospital bed and made him promise to take care of me. And the memory struck him visibly, his jaw tightening, his eyes lowering to the table. Consequences, I realized then, are not always lawsuits or foreclosures. Sometimes they are the moment you see yourself reflected in your parents' disappointed gaze. He did not shout. He did not threaten again. He simply sat there for several minutes, staring at the grain of the wooden table. And then he said something I had not expected to hear so soon. "I made this worse than it had to be." It was not a full apology, not yet, but it was the first crack in the certainty that had driven him since the wedding. When he left that night, he did not slam the door. He paused in the doorway, looked back once as if trying to memorize the room, and then stepped out into the cool evening air. And I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car engine fading down the street. I did not know whether he would choose pride or humility next, whether this story would end in reconciliation or in permanent fracture. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not trade dignity for convenience. And if closure was coming, it would not arrive because I surrendered. It would arrive because the truth finally outweighed the narrative. There is a particular kind of silence that comes before truth. Not the tense silence of anger or the brittle silence of avoidance, but the quiet that settles when pride has exhausted itself and reality stands at the door waiting to be acknowledged. And that is the silence that filled my house 3 weeks after Daniel asked me to leave, when the phone rang just after dusk and his voice on the other end no longer carried urgency, only something fragile and unguarded. "Mom," he said. And for the first time in months there was no strategy beneath the word, no audience, no narrative to maintain. The business had collapsed. The investor who once praised his ambition had withdrawn completely. The lender, after reviewing inconsistencies in occupancy disclosures, had frozen further extensions and initiated formal review. Claire had moved temporarily to her sister's house, not in anger, he insisted, but in exhaustion. The house, the one they believed would be the anchor of their future, had become a complication instead of a solution. And as he spoke, I did not hear failure. I heard a man confronting the consequences of choices he could no longer rearrange with speeches. He asked if he could come over, not to negotiate, not to request signatures, just to talk. When he arrived, he did knock this time. I opened the door slowly, and the porch light revealed a face that looked older than it had a month ago. The confidence that once shaped his posture replaced by something softer, something closer to the boy who used to reach for my hand in crowded places. He stepped inside quietly, glancing around the living room as if seeing it for the first time, not as an asset, not as leverage, but as a home layered with memory. We sat at the same kitchen table where so many of our recent battles had unfolded, and he placed a folder in front of me without theatrics. Inside were updated financial statements, letters from the lender, correspondence from attorneys, everything transparent, everything laid bare. There was no performance now, only fact. I should have told them about the occupancy clause, he admitted, his voice steady but low. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. I thought if I just pushed hard enough, everything would fall into place. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the folder. And I thought you would step aside because you always have. That sentence did not wound me the way it once might have. Instead, it clarified something that had taken months to fully surface. I had loved him so consistently, so unconditionally, that he had mistaken my support for flexibility without limit. I had raised him to be ambitious, resilient, determined. But I had not realized, I also taught him, unintentionally, that I would absorb the impact of his risks. I won't disappear for you, I said gently, not with anger, not with accusation, but with truth. But I will stand beside you while you repair what you broke. The words seemed to steady him more than any contract could have. He leaned back in his chair, eyes glistening in a way he did not attempt to hide this time. I embarrassed you, he said finally. And there it was, the acknowledgement that had been missing since the wedding day. I tried to make it look like you were the obstacle so I wouldn't have to admit I was scared. Perception is louder than paperwork, I had once thought, but truth, when finally spoken, carries farther than either. Over the next hour, we did not strategize about lawsuits or sales. We discussed responsibility. We spoke about transparency. We talked about the difference between protecting pride and protecting family. He admitted that the wedding announcement had been rehearsed with Claire, designed to frame a narrative before anyone could question his decisions. He admitted he had underestimated the legal structure I put in place, assuming maternal loyalty would override documentation. And in admitting these things, he seemed smaller but somehow more solid, like a foundation rebuilt correctly after cracks appear. I don't want the house anymore, he said at last. Not like that. Not if it costs this. It was not a dramatic declaration, not the triumphant moment some might expect, but it carried weight because it was voluntary. The asset he once pursued so aggressively had lost its shine once stripped of illusion. In the weeks that followed, he worked directly with the lender to restructure his obligations without relying on the property. He liquidated personal investments, took on additional consulting contracts, made difficult calls he had previously postponed. Claire returned home, not to my house, but to their small apartment. And for the first time since the wedding, they made decisions based on numbers rather than appearances. The house remained mine. Not because I fought louder, not because I punished him, but because I refused to surrender quietly. One Sunday morning, several months later, Daniel asked if he could walk with me to church. The same third pew, the same filtered light through stained glass. Mrs. Talbot offered a hesitant smile that gradually softened when Daniel greeted her politely and without defensiveness. No announcements were made, no speeches delivered, just presence. After service, as we stepped outside into the cool air, Daniel reached for my arm gently, not out of necessity but out of habit, reborn. "You were right to hold your ground," he said quietly. "If you had given in, I would have learned nothing. Justice does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as clarity." That evening, as I stood alone in my kitchen washing dishes, the scent of lemon soap rising softly in the steam, I looked around at the walls that had witnessed pride, conflict, humiliation, and finally, honesty. The house felt different now, not heavier, not triumphant, but balanced. I realized then that closure is not the moment your child kneels in apology or the world publicly corrects its perception. Closure is the quiet understanding that you remained whole when it would have been easier to fracture. Daniel did not bury me that day at his wedding. He only mistook my silence for weakness. And in the end, the only thing that was sold was his illusion that I would ever disappear from my own life. If this story meant something to you, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to Silent Tales Studio, where silence speaks and stories answer.